All right, so we'll say good morning, good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. Sorry, thought I had it up here. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev Haba Alinu Lutova. Allison Adam Steinmetz, memory of Adam's grandfather, Rabbi Sheldon Steinmetz, Harav Shlomo Tzvi Ruvain, Ben Shimon Zichron Livracha, and the schos that his Neshama Shtav and Aliyah, Shibei Melis Yosef, for his children, his grandchildren, and his 34 great-grandchildren. Sammy and Malka Esterson, in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib Ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim, in memory of their dear family friend, Staff Sergeant Naftali Yonah Gordon Hashemi Kom Damo, fell in battle in Gaza on Erev Chanukah 2023. Pauline Kathy Pollock, in memory of Leah Bas Shmuel, Zachrini Shulamis Bas Shmuel, and Esther Bas Zacharia. Our Day of Learning sponsors, Steve and Jordana Galaskov, Le'ilui Nishmas, Steve's father, Nasan Sender Ben Meshulam Nasan, whose fourth yard site is today, Yud Beis Kislev. And our Daf Yomi sponsors, Ayala and Sarah Steinberg, and the schos of continued health for Shulamis Chana Bas Susha, Ron Myrovitz, in honor of the bris of his grandson, Shibizochem Eretz Hashem, to enter in Torah, Chuppah, Umaisim Tovim, and Abe and Michelle Zerkayer, Le'ilui Nishmas Nochum Sender Ben Meshulam Nasan, the father of Steve Kalaskov, so beautiful. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah shleima, to have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shirei Meretz Hashem continue to send besoros tovos for Am Yisrael. Both say with that, let us be with a really exciting Gemara ahead of us today. So we are picking up today's daf is Ayin Tes 79, and we are picking up Meretz Hashem on Ayin Chesma Beis 78b Tanoihi. So if you remember again, we had a fascinating and riveting machlokes yesterday about how this whole concept of bittul, right, nullification and negation works, specifically in one area, right? Because remember again, when it comes to min b'she'eno mino, when it comes to two dissimilar items which are mixed together, so pretty much, at least at this point, everyone is agreeing, how do you determine the identity of the mixture? How do you determine it? Taste. Tam. The shaila is min b'mino, right? When you have two similar items mixed together, how do you determine identity ultimately of the mixture? So first opinion says rove. Good old rove, right? Just go after simple majority. Whatever the majority of the mixture is, that's going to determine the identity. Second opinion says something very interesting, which is no, you view the secondary item as if it's a dissimilar item, and try to figure out if it was a dissimilar item in this ratio, how would it impact the mixture? Good. So the Gemara says, Tanaihi. In reality, this whole thing is a machlokes. So we'll say on 78 BE, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Lines up from the bottom. Tonight, this is a really interesting case. Delishi yishba yayin lavan o chalav. So we'll say here's the case. I have a bucket, and I am immersing the bucket in a mikvah. The bucket is tameh, right? So now what happens? So there is liquid inside of the interior, inside of the bucket. So now I'm immersing the bucket in the mikvah. So the shaila now is, again, given that there's some foreign material inside of the bucket, so when the water comes in, is the water going to be able to affect tara inside of the bucket or not? That's the shaila. So the Gemara says, I have a bucket that's filled with white wine or milk. Now what's the good part about white wine and milk? What's the good part? They look like water, right? They're water-like. The milk part is a little bit scary, especially depending on which mikveh you're going to, right? But apparently, again, at least milk is similar enough in its color and its consistency to look like water. So the Gemara says, and what happens? You immerse the bucket. Vit bilo. Rashi says over here, vit bilo, velo shafach masha besocho, and what happens? And you didn't spill out the contents of the bucket. So Nabal says, what's the halacha? Holchin achar harof. Ultimately, again, we go after the rove. We'll say, now what is this? Now again, so what is this a case of? This is a case of min b'mino, right? Because remember, what we're doing over here is we're assuming that the water and the wine are similar enough to the milk and the wine, similar enough to the water, that this makes it a min b'mino case. So therefore, again, what does the Gemara say? Tanakama holds, rove, min b'mino, ultimately again we go after the rove. Rabbi Huda says, Rowan also kiluhu yain adam. Rabbi Huda says we view the wine, let's just go with the white wine, we view the white wine as if it's red wine, and therefore what do? Im dihamar ehu kasher v'im lav pasal. And we see, if it was red wine in there, would there be enough mikvah water that got into the interior of the bucket, ultimately again, to lighten the wine? And when we say lighten, it means turn the appearance of the wine from red to white, or not? Or not? So we'll say, what do you see from this? What do you see ultimately again from this brisa? That there's a machlokes, a fundamental machlokes about how to deal with min b'mino. So ultimately again, Tanakama holds min b'mino, batal barov. Rabbi Huda holds min b'mino. We view the substance as if it's she'ein amino, a dissimilar substance, and we view what would happen to it in this ratio. Incredible, incredible. Somewhere says Raminhu, Ariza Kasha, Dli Shu Mali Rokin, Vit Biluki Lotabal. If you have a bucket that is filled with spit, and you immerse it in the mikvah, right? It's as if it has not been immersed. Okay, again, we'll discuss this. Rashi says over here, kilu lo taval, sharok of v'chotzetz b'fnei hamayim ve'eno batal b'mayim. I will say the reason this is different. So spit, right, is considered to be thicker. So because it's thicker, there's a concern that the water doesn't permeate it. That's the real concern over here. On the other hand, meiraglayim, what happens if you have a bucket filled with urine, so you immerse it in the mikvah? Rowan also kiloi mayim. So we view it as if it's water. View it as if it's water. Good. So therefore we'll say, remember, that would make it a min b'mino type of situation. Male mechatos. This is very interesting. Let's say you have a bucket filled with mechatos. Remember again, what's mechatos? Mechatos is the water that's mixed with the ashes of the para aduma. So let's say you have a bucket filled with mechatos, and you immerse that in the mikvah. So what's the halacha? Ad sheyirbu hamayim al mechatos. So ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, we look at rov, that as long as the water in the mikvah will be the majority over the water of the mechatos, ultimately again, the bucket will consider to be immersed. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Mali mechatos, hoil vehin avatuma, v'chashivi mishum kiddusha sayu, lo batlinan ella beruba. So remember again, I both say, the interesting part, you'll say to yourself, I don't understand, the water of mechatos, why would the water of mechatos pose a problem for a mikvah? It's water and it's water. Because remember again, the way para aduma, the water para aduma works, remember what does it do? Technically speaking, it conveys tumah to a tahar person who touches it. So because of that, it's considered to be, interesting from a halachic perspective, a tamei material. Look at the next Rashi. So therefore again, if you have a bucket filled with mechatos, ultimately again, if there's the majority of mikvah water in the interior of the bucket, then ultimately again, it's tarif not. Look at Rashi. Achiru mayim ein tvila ola lekli achi yishpoch meyoser mechatzev shokli kidei shirbo benechas mechatos. Good. So says the Gemara. Here we go. So we'll say so. Three cases: spit, urine, mechatos. So the Gemara says like this: Man shamislei the islay rowan. Now both say. Now remember again, the way it worked was like this, right? In the case of the spit, we said the tefillah is invalid. Why? Because it's thick. Therefore, again, there's a concern that the water doesn't permeate. In the case of the urine, what did we say? That ultimately, again, we view the urine as if it's water. We view the water as, so says the Gemara. I don't understand. Says the Gemara, Man sham islay, the islay rowan. Who is the opinion who says rowan? Now, let's remember again, what's the sheet of rowan? The sheet of rowan says that in any min b'mino situation, we view the item as if it's a dissimilar item and mixes it in and figures out what does it do in that ratio. So who says rowan? That's Rabbi Huda. V'katoni d'sagile beruba. Yet Rabbi say, it's interestingly enough, Rabbi Huda holds of rowan, but yet again the Brisa says that halacha l'maisa we go after the majority. So how do you reconcile that? That's contradictory because again I will say we viewed it as two different opinions. One opinion says that by min b'mino you go after rov. Second opinion says by min b'mino we use the concept of rowan. It's not a contradiction. Both say top of ayin hadidei hadrabe. Two different opinions. Rabbi Yehuda himself holds min b'mino is batal barov. That's what Rabbi Yehuda holds, right? When you have a mixture of similar items, ultimately again it is batal in a majority. His Rebbe holds rowan. So the Rashi says over here, Hadrabe hadisnan le'el rono so kilu yain adam drabehu the machnir bebitel. So let's look at Rashi. Sorry, let's look at the Gemara. The Sanya. Here it is. Rabbi Yehuda over Mishra Rabbi Gamliel. So what's Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of his Rebbe, Rabbi Gamliel? Ein dam mevatel dam. One blood ultimately again can't negate another blood. That's min bamino. Right? Min bamino is in a bottle. Ein rok mevatel rok. Right, one saliva, right, let's say again, tahar, saliva that is tahar, cannot be mevatel saliva that is tameh. Ve'i meiraglayim mevatlin meiraglayim. And ultimately, again, urine can't be mevatel urine. I will say in all these cases is where a tahar item gets mixed in with a tameh item. Shabbos says, now this is very interesting. Right, so now what we're highlighting over here is, in fact, this is a machlokes. Even Rabbi Yehuda himself actually holds that min bamino is batal barov. It's his Rebbe, Rabbi Gamliel, who holds that when you have a case of min bamino, what do? We go ahead and we say rowan. Now, guys, remember, so what does rowan mean? Rowan means we view the item as if it's a dissimilar item, and then we figure out in this type of ratio what would be the impact of the secondary item on the primary item. That's what the rowan means. And again, I just want to point out, remember, that's a lot how our Mishnah operated, right? Because again, when you have blood mixed in with blood or blood mixed in with wine, right? So ultimately, again, we figure out what would happen if the similar item that was mixed in was a dissimilar item. How would it impact the primary item in this ratio? So just want to point out, now, one of the points to remember, well, let's finish up a little more in the Gemara. The Gemara goes back to the Gemara says, so Rava says, no. Now Rava wants to reinvent the case of the bucket in the mikvah. Rava Amar, bidli shetocho tahar, vegabo tamei askina. This is very interesting. Rava says maybe the case of the bucket is a different kind of case. It's a case of a bucket ultimately, again, where the interior is tahar and the outside is tamei. So a different kind of case. Rashi says over here, Rava Amar, it's almost right across in Rashi, Li olam chad tanahu kirabei svirale. In reality, so Rava wants to reinterpret it. Rava wants to say, there's actually only one Tana in this Mishnah, and Rabbi Yehuda agrees with his Rabbi Gamliel, about rowing. So the Gemara says, so what's the case over here? The Gemara says, the Medina sagila b'choldu. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at Rashi, bidli shesocho tar v'gabel tamei kigon shenitma gabel betumas mashkin dirabanan the kamlan tocho ognova ozna v'yadav torin. Okay, this is an interesting case. So we'll say there's a concept that in certain rabbinic forms of tumah, the exterior of the kli could become tamei, but not the interior. Now that only works with rabbinic tumah. In any case of biblical tumah, when the outside of the kli becomes tamei, the entire kli becomes tamei. But let's say, for example, in a case where let's say you have mashkin tamein, liquids that are impure. So the halacha is, if impure liquid touches the exterior of a utensil, the exterior becomes tamei, but the interior is totally tahar. Now, therefore, we'll say, in that kind of case, how do you purify that kli? How do you purify it? A mikvah. Now, remember, when we talk about the exterior of the kli, what's included in the exterior? What's included in that? The top lip, which means that in order for the kli to become tahar, what do you need? You need at least a little bit of water to come into the interior, right? Because otherwise, if water doesn't come into the interior, then what? We have to be concerned that maybe it didn't go all the way around the lip. So therefore, I guess just play this out for just a second. This is a detail sheba details. So remember again, I have a kli. The back of my kli came in contact with liquids which are tamei. Therefore, midrabanan, the outside of my kli is tamei, the interior of my kli is tar. I'm taking my kli to the mikvah. Technically speaking, all that has to happen over here is the mikvah has to touch the exterior of my kli and the top exterior lip. In order to ensure that it touches the entire exterior lip, I need the mikvah waters to come in a little bit. How much water do I need on the interior of the mikvah? How much? Very little, just a little bit, just to ensure that the mikvah water touches the entire top exterior of the kli. So the Gemara says something very interesting. So watch this. So the Gemara says, Rava wants to suggest, the medina in reality, all you need is a little bit of mikvah water to come into the interior of the kli. But what happened? The rabbi stepped in, and they were gozer, and they said, no, you have to fill the entire interior of the kli with mikvah waters in that case as well, or at least the majority. Right? You need ultimately, again, why? Tilma chayis alayhu v'lo mevatale. V'cheis Gemara says, v'chevendikaribuya lo tzarech. So this is very interesting. The Rabbanan were the ones who said that even in a case where the exterior of the kli is tameh, and therefore all you need ultimately, again, is for the water to really just a little bit on the interior. Halacha l'maisa, the Rabbanan said you have to fill up the kli, at least the rov of the kli, with mikvah water. Why? Because we're concerned that if you're not doing that, you're not going to properly immerse the exterior of the kli as well. Interesting. And ultimately, again, once you have, even though the Rabbanan said, really, we want you just to fill up the entire interior of the kli with mikvah water, but once you have the majority of the kli interior filled with mikvah water, that's going to be enough. Incredible, incredible. So the Rabbanan said, just a different way of interpreting ultimately again that previous brisa. Interesting cases here. Amar Rava. So therefore Rava say Rava comes along and reformulates the halacha as well. Amar Rabbanan b'taima, v'amar Rabbanan beruba, v'amar Rabbanan bechazusa. Sometimes Rava say in cases of mixtures, the rabbis say that the identity of the mixture is dependent on taste. Sometimes it is dependent on majority, and sometimes it is dependent on appearance. Right? So Rabbi says, so three ways of determining the halachic identity of a mixture. Majority, taste, appearance. Which is which? Here we go. Rabbi said, this is incredibly important. Underline these lines. If it's your Gemara. Min b'she'eno mino b'taima. Number one, if you have two dissimilar items mixed together, right? It is determined by taste. Taste. Ultimate taste. The Gemara says, min b'mino. Two similar items. Rabbi say again, you can't use taste, right? And it's very important. In general, min b'mino, you can't use taste because again, they're similar items. So therefore, how do we determine the identity of the mixture? Beruba, rov, and ultimately again, heichadika chazusa. But in a case of min b'mino, of an item that you're not going to eat, so how do we determine ultimately identity? Chazusa. By appearance. We'll say, what's the case of min b'mino? Ultimately, again, where you're not going to eat. Look at Rashi. Heicha di'ika chazusa. Second one line in Rashi. Mili de lo tali b'taime ala b'chazusa kegon le'inyan tvilas mikva. Right? A good example of this would be by the mikvah cases. Right? So the milk gets mixed in with the water. Right? So again, these are cases where you're not tasting. Right? You're not tasting the mikvah water. In general, just a good idea, like a good approach, right? Keep your mouth closed, right. But lamaisa, again, you're not, or for our purposes also, the cases of the blood, right? Sacrificial blood, where you're not tasting any of this. So again, so interestingly enough, min b'she'eno mino, going to be dependent on taste. Min b'mino, if it's a case where you could taste the item, ultimately again, then we'll go after rov. Otherwise, we're going to go after appearance. Incredible. So we'll say, so that is a very important piece of halachic, of halacha l'maisa. Now again, the truth is, just so you should know, we actually did this in Smichas Chaver last week. Today, right, contemporarily, we don't rely on tam anymore, right? On taste. So for our purposes, whenever you see the concept of tam, we replace that with shishim. Batal b'shishim. It's the same idea. We assume ultimately again that any tam, any flavor ultimately again is negated in a ratio of 60-1. But in the pure form of halacha, these lines of Rava are halacha l'maisa. So min b'she'eno mino, two dissimilar items, we go after taste. Min b'mino, if it's something tasteable, ultimately again we'll go after rov. Again, or I should say, even independent of that. Min b'mino will go after rov, unless of course it's a case where there's no taste element, in which case we'll go after appearance. Incredible. Upligid Rabbi Lazar. And this argues on Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Lazar says, "Kish is incredible. It's incredible. Kishim shem mitzvos mevatlos zu azu, kach ein isurin mevatlin zu azu." And all of this argues on Rabbi Lazar. Why Rabbi say now again? Remember, everything up until now we've been focusing on is this idea that Isser could be mevatel Isser. Right? That there's that concept that ultimately, again, Isser can be negated. So the Gemara just says over here, just understand that there is an opinion, ultimately, again, Rabbi Lazar, that the same way that mitzvos can't negate each other, so too Isurin cannot negate each other. Right? You can't be mevatel Isser. So the Gemara says, 1 second. What does this mean? Man shambas leidaron ein mitzvos mevatel azu. That's an interesting statement. What do you mean that mitzvos can't negate each other? What does that mean? So get ready for this. So Gemara says, Zu Hillel. So I will say ultimately again, this is Hillel. This is Hillel. What did Hillel say? Visanya Amru Alav al Hillel. They said about Hillel Zakim, Shekarchan bevas achas va'ochlan. Hillel, what was it? Karban Pesach. Karban Pesach. How did Hillel eat his Karban Pesach? He would eat it all together. He would take the Pesach, the Paschal lamb, matzah, and maror, and he would go ahead and eat it all together. Mishum shene'emar amatzos umerorim yochluhu, because the pasuk says you shall eat it on matzah and maror together. So quite literally, Hillel went ahead and ate this all together. And I will say, I'll just point out something interesting. There's a number of very interesting pieces about this. So this is korech. So remember again, Hillel. First of all, the commentaries point out that you see from here that historically matzah was soft, right? I will say, just think about this for just a moment, right? Think of this, right? We do this at our seder, right? You take Pesach, you take the matzah. We don't have Pesach yet, but you take the matzah, you take the mar, you take a little bit of charoses, and you eat it together. And what happens when you take a bite out of it? What happens when you take a bite out of it? It's a culinary catastrophe, right? The whole thing is like ridiculous, right? It's crazy, right? So a sandwich like that with the matzahs that we have doesn't make any sense. But if you understand that historically they had soft matzahs, then essentially what is Hillel making? It's a shawarma, right? It's a shawarma, especially again before kitnius, right? You can have a lot of the toppings also, right? So l'maisa again, I can't have any other toppings, right? But l'maisa again, so that's what he did, and that's what even lashon of korech means, really to wrap something. So literally again, Hillel would take his soft matzah, put his Pesach lamb, his maror, again chassa is what they would use, lettuce, right? Because they didn't use horseradish, lettuce, and they would wrap it all together, and that's how Hillel would eat Karban Pesach. Now, there's something very interesting about that. So the Gemara says, what do you see from Hillel? That ein mitzvos mevatel and zuazu. Now let's take a step back for just a second. Why is it that everyone disagrees with Hillel? Right? The other parents disagree with Hillel. Why do they disagree? Because they hold you can't eat it like that, because if you eat it like that, then the taste of Pesach is working against the taste of matzah, which is working against the taste of maror. In order to perform the mitzvahs, you have to have the experience of the individual tastes of the mitzvah of the mitzvahs. But if you're combining it all together, then Vevatel zu et zu. You don't have the full effect of the matzah, the full effect of the Pesach, and the full effect ultimately of the maror. So the Hillel's disputants say mitzvos mevatel zu et zu. They negate each other. Hillel says no, they don't. Mitzvahs can't be mevatel each other. So because of that, Hillel allows you to wrap everything up together. But everyone else would say mitzvahs mevatel and zu et zu, and therefore you have to eat them separately. So that's the machlokes. So anyway, the Gemara says over here the same way ultimately again, that ein mitzvah mevatlin zu, and who is that? That's Hillel. That's ultimately again Hillel. It says ein mitzvah mevatlin zu. I will say I'm a base. So turn Rabbanon. So therefore again I will say, so again, continue with this fundamental machlokes. So turn Rabbanon. I will say, just so you should know, there's also this beautiful idea, just like hashkafically, what's at the core of like this machlokes in Hillel and the Rabbanon in terms of how to eat this. See, the Rabbanon will say, really it's a life machlokes. That in life, there are different periods. There are different periods of life. There's matzah periods and there's maror periods. The matzah periods represent, again, the times of geula, the times of redemption, the times of simcha. And there are maror periods in life. And ultimately, again, there are different periods. There are peaks and valleys. Hillel says that's not the dynamic of the Jew. In Hillel's worldview, hayakarchan va'ochlan ka'achos. The life of the Jew is matzah and maror all wrapped together. Meaning, how do we exist? I will say, in our moments of matzah simcha, we recognize we still feel the maror. This not in a depressing way, but again, I will say, if you think about this. Right? What do we do at a chasana? Right? What do we do at a chasana? Right? The pinnacle of joy. Right? Everything is so beautiful. What happens in that moment when the chasana is about to conclude? We break the glass. You ever think to yourself, "Come on, right? Come on! Like, why can't we just have this? Right? Why must we always bring in something depressing, right? And even like the dichotomy of it is so strange, right? And again, especially like by like our chasanas, like Meshkachech takes like about an hour and a half, right? So every single niggun of the Meshkachech ever invented by Klal Yisrael, right? You see, and then what happens? Smash the glass, and then Mazel Tov. It's like what? And it's interesting, right? People. It's so funny. People try to find ways to make it more normal. So what will they do? They'll break the glass in the middle of the Meshkachech, and then the Meshkachech finishes. No one knows quite what to do. Mazel Tov, yes, Mazel Tov, no Mazel Tov. And sometimes you just have to lean into it, meaning that Hillel says that's the life of a Yid. The life of a Yid is that even in the midst of incredible simcha, I always carry the pain of our people. How could I not carry the pain of the people? How can I not carry the pain of the fact that I don't yet have a Beis HaMikdash? And I don't have to pretend like it's not there. There's always a pain that's there. There's always a void that's there. There's always something that hurts inside of you. That's why, both say for so many of us, we're never more than 4 seconds away from crying. Why? Because there's a palpable pain of 2,000 years of collective pain that is built up inside of me. And the motor is there even in the midst of the matzah. The motor is always there even in the midst of the matzah. But the opposite is true also. That even in times of incredible motor, the matzah of redemption is there as well. Because no matter how acute the pain is, I know that Geula is so close, that redemption is so close. Personal Geula, national Geula. So Hillel says, wrap it all up together, because that's what a Jew is. A Jew is someone who lives with his matzah and his motor together at all times. There is pain and there is joy. There is rejoicing and there is profound sadness. And it's not a contradiction. It's just called being a Jew. And I experience both of those dynamics. Sometimes it's more matzah, less maror. Sometimes it's more maror and it's more matzah. But in times of maror, the matzah gives me such hope and optimism that things are going to be great. And in times of matzah, I must always be ever cognizant of still the collective, historical, and present pain of my people. And we wrap that all together. And Hillel says, that's what it means to be a Jew. Tanabanan. Let's go right there. Charsan shel zav v'zava. Okay, so we'll say, let's get into bedpans. All right, so the Gemara says as follows: a charson is essentially a bedpan, right? But it means it's an earthenware utensil that was used that is now containing the urine of a zav or a zava. Now, understand that the urine of a zav or a zava conveys tumah. So watch this case: charson shel zav v'zava. So both say, now Rashi says over here, Charson shel zav v'zava avit shalmei raglayim. So it's a bedpan used for v'nishpar v'charasav bela'o mimei raglayim hazamvein tmeim b'masa sha'ava bish nivlu tmeim kisan. So again, the idea over here is there's this earthenware bedpan. The earthenware bedpan broke. I now have a shard of that bedpan. Okay, so now the Gemara is like this. So what? Okay, I don't know. Whatever it is. People attach sentimental value to different things, right? So the Gemara says as follows. So now, I will say, so the shaila is there a way to be metahar that? Obviously it absorbed the urine of the zav, and therefore it's going to be tameh. So pan rishon v'sheni tameh. So I will say, interestingly enough, if you soak it with water, if you soak it in water the first time and the second time, it still retains its tumah status, shlishi tar. But interestingly enough, if you soak it a third time, ultimately, again, it becomes tar. So we'll say the idea is that through... Now, again, what I want to point out over here is, you'll say to yourself, one second, this is earthenware, right? Earthenware 101 is that whatever an earthenware object absorbs, you can't get out. That's only when there's heat. So remember again, the difference over here is obviously it's not a cooking utensil, right? This is a bedpan. So lamaisa, it absorbed liquid without a heat medium. So because of that, what the Gemara tells us is, essentially, if you wash it out, if you soak it 3 times, ultimately whatever is absorbed within the utensil comes out. Okay? When is that so? Shenasan l'socha mayim. That's true only if you went ahead and you put water into it. But ultimately, again, I will say, now, that's only if you put water in there. But what if you put something else? Now, I will say, now, what else would you be putting in there? Let's say you put urine in there. But in this case over here, you put the urine of a tahar person. Right, so now let's say again. So now this was a bedpan used by a zav or a zava, so it absorbed impure urine. Let's say now again you fill it with urine, but of a tahar person. So I would have thought maybe that has the same cleansing effect. Kamash malon, it does not. It does not. Now both say, now why doesn't it? What is it saying? Min b'mino lo batal. Because Rabbi say urine is urine, right? And even though the urine of the zav is tamei, and the urine of a regular person is tahar, but it's min b'mino, and therefore min b'mino, two similar items, lo batal. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov Omer, shlishi afapi shlonas l'soch hamayim tar. Rabbi Elazar disagrees. Rabbi Elazar says, no, if you soak it 3 times, even in urine, ultimately, again, bless you, the tamei urine is going to come out, and therefore, again, the kli is going to be tar. So Rabbi says, what do you see from here? Rabbi Elazar holds, min b'mino, batal. Batal. Somewhere the mansham say there are min b'mino lo batal. Who is the opinion that says min b'mino is not batal? That's Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, or minu, bari zakasha. Pishtan shetavaso nida masito tar. So this is an interesting case. If you have flax that was spun into thread, and it was a nida, a woman who was a nida who did it, it's tar. Now, what's going on over here? So apparently, to go ahead and spin flax into thread, you have to moisten like the fibers with you put it in your mouth. You moisten it with your saliva. Now, the saliva of a nida conveys tumah, it's tamei. So again, I will say, but interestingly enough, we're talking about a case over here where even if the woman was a nida spun the thread, and therefore the pashtos, her saliva was used to moisten the fabric. Ultimately, again, at this point in time when it's finished thread, it's dry, and therefore if someone goes ahead and moves it, it's going to be tar. Once the saliva dries, obviously it doesn't convey tumah. But again, if the saliva was moist, then masito tame mishum mashkepia. Then one who goes ahead and moves the thread is ultimately again going to become tame as a result of her saliva. Rabbi Yehuda says, af harot vo b'mayim Tame mishum mashkepia vafilu tuva. Not only that, ultimately Rabbi Yehuda says not only that, but halacha l'maisa, even if one takes the thread that dries and then what? Soaks it again in water, even a lot of water, ultimately again the person is going to go ahead and become tamei. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, Rabbi Yehuda Omer af, it's almost right across. Rabbi Yehuda Omer af harotev b'mayim tamei mishum mashkevia b'tosef to the Meseches Taras af hamalach locho b'mayim la'achar sheyavesh chazer harok lios lach machmas hamayim to tamei mishum mashkevia. Say even about say you take dry thread, which means again, her saliva was used, but now it's dried. So Yehuda says, if you take that thread and now you moisten it, what's the halacha? Ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, it almost like awakens the saliva, and therefore you become tamei. So the Gemara says, Amar Papa, that case is different. Why? And again, I will say that's true, even if what? Even if it's a lot of water. So in other words, what do you see from here? That even min b'mino is lo batal. Iminos labatal, to which the Gemara says, no, Amra Papa, shani rok de karir. So saliva is different. Why is saliva different? Mishum de karash says karir means what? Shani rok de karir. So he says, nichnas bepishnan bechazaka, v'kasha latzeis, avamei raglaim lo beli becheres kulehai. So apparently, the Gemara says, so saliva, because it's thicker, becomes a bit more embedded in the thread. So therefore, again, when it's there, it's present. Therefore, when you go ahead and you moisten the thread, this opinion holds that halacha l'maisa, the saliva, so to speak, comes back to life, and therefore, again, it can convey tumah. That may be different, ultimately, again, than the case of the urine, because as much as the urine becomes embedded in the earthenware utensil, it doesn't become so heavily embedded. Okay, so bottom line, that's the end of that sugya. So bottom line, again, if somebody offers you a shard from a bedpan used by a zav, take a hard pass on that, right? But only because of halacha, right? Only because of halacha, right? But because you're not exactly sure if you could rectify it. But leaving that aside, again, the Gemara really emerges with the conclusion that we mentioned before, which is that halacha l'maisa. So the one case that's going to continuously be a machlokes is the case of min b'mino, right? What do we do in the case of min b'mino when you have two similar items, ultimately again, that are mixed together? So do we say that min b'mino is just settled with a simple majority, batal barov, or do we employ this concept of what we call roin? that we view the secondary item as if it is a dissimilar item, and then see what would be the impact of the secondary item on the primary item if the secondary item was a dissimilar item mixed in this ratio. That's called Rav. So that's our ongoing machlokes. The Gemara itself, Rav itself, tells us our halacha l'maisa, that the way we deal is min b'she'eino mino, two dissimilar items. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that mixture? Tam, taste. Does the secondary item infuse taste into the primary item? If it does, then it's going to be aser. If it doesn't, then it's going to be mutter. For our contemporary purposes, that translates into shishim, right? Batal b'shishim, 60 to 1 or 1 to 60 ratio. When it comes to min b'mino, so there are two ways of dealing with min b'mino. Ultimately, again, if it's an item that is subject to taste, then we go simple, we go after the rov. That's halacha. Min b'mino is batal b'rov. Or, again, in certain cases where there's no taste component, we'll go basar chazusa. We'll go ultimately, again, after appearance, like we see in the case of the mikvah. Incredible, incredible. All right, we'll say, let's finish this up. Says the Gemara, this ari b'dama psul yishpoch la'amos. We'll say, remember again, so this is the end of the Mishnah. This is the end of the Mishnah, and the Mishnah spoke about the following idea: if you have invalid sacrificial blood that gets mixed in with kosher sacrificial blood, what do? You pour it down the channel. What's the channel? So remember again, again, we're going to talk more about this channel, but this is a channel that ultimately, like a drainage system in the primary parts of the Beis HaMikdash, and ultimately, again, this channel would then flow out into the Kidron Valley. So if you have invalid sacrificial blood mixed with valid sacrificial blood, pour it down the channel, and ultimately, again, dispose of it. So says the Gemara, b'may kamifligi. Sorry, and the end of the Mishnah then said, Rabbi Eliezer machshir. So Rabbi Eliezer says ultimately again the mixture is kosher. I'm both saying now there were two cases over here. Case number one is where you had ultimately again invalid sacrificial blood mixed in with valid sacrificial blood, right? And ultimately again case number two is damatamsis. What's damatamsis? Damatamsis ultimately again is non-lifeblood, what we'll call residual blood. So in both of these cases, the Tanna Kama said, this mixture is invalid, pour it down the drain, pour it down the channel. Rabbi Eliezer says, it's kosher. It's kosher, right? Ultimately, again, it's kosher. So the Gemara says, so what's going on over here? What's the machlok? It's very interesting. Ma kamiflagi. Rav Zvid, begozun gzer b'mikdash kamiflagi. So we'll say Rav Zvid says, the machlokes is, do we go ahead and make rabbinic gzeros in the Beis HaMikdash? Now, what does this mean? Look at Rashi. This is Rashi has 6 lines up from before it gets wide. Begozun gzer b'mikdash pligi, im osin siag b'kodshim, laharchik min ha'avera, v'lo chayshina lahefsid kodshim, shalo yafsid es elu, b'shil siag de'achem kamiflagi. So we'll say, here's the shayla. Do we make rabbinic protective? Do we enact rabbinic protective laws in the Beis HaMikdash, where those protective laws will result in the loss of certain sacrificial matter? Because remember, think about this in just a moment. When invalid sacrificial blood gets mixed in with sacrificial blood, so we'll say, so what is that? What is that a case of? What is that a case of? What is it a case of? Min b'mino. How do you resolve min b'mino? Rov. Oh. Right? Am I in the right place? Right? Isn't that Yomi Zevachim? Okay, good. Okay, good. So again, right? Min b'mino. So this seems to be a classic case of min b'mino, which ultimately again is batal b'rov. So what's? I don't understand. What's the issue over here? Even in the Rowan case, remember again, it all has the appearance of blood because it's blood getting mixed in with blood. So what's going on over here? So it says the Gemara. So listen to this. The Mar Savar Gozrin, Umar Savar Lo Gozrin. So we'll say, so ultimately our concern over here, so the Tanna Kama holds Gozrin. We create rabbinic enactments, ultimately again in the Beis HaMikdash, even though that's going to lead to the loss of sacrificial matter. Take a look at Rashi, 2-3 lines up before it gets wide. Tanna Kama Savar Gozrin, Hilchach this Arev Dam Kasher B'Dam Pasal, O B'Dam Atamsis, V'Afa B'Shein B'Psol V'Lo Atamsis Kili L'Vatal Sakasher, Yishbach La'ama, Dilma Asilach Shurei Nami Heicha D'Yesh Dam B'Dam Pasal, B'Dam Atamsis Kili L'Vatal Sakasher. So we'll say, watch this. Tanna Kama is concerned like this. In our case in the Mishnah, we're talking about a case of dam atamsis or dam pasal that got mixed in with a larger amount of dam kosher. So this should be an open and shut case of min b'mino, batal b'rov, use the blood, move on. What are the Rabbanan concerned about? The Rabbanan concerned about is that this is an easily confusable case. And people might assume that whenever dam puzzle gets mixed in with dam kosher in any ratio, the mixture is always kosher. In order to avoid that, the rabbi said, spill out the blood. So even though, what are you doing? You're causing a loss to hekdesh, right? Because now you're taking sacrificial blood, which is technically okay. Right? You're taking the kosher and you're spilling it out. So the Tanakhama says it is a good gzeira. We should make the gzeira ultimately again because it safeguards the sanctity ultimately of sacrificial service. Umar Savalo Gazrinan, whereas the other opinion, which is Rabbi Eliezer holds, no, we do not make rabbinic protective gzeros in the Beis Hamikdash. This is a classic case of min b'mino, batal barov, use the blood, move on. Rav Papa's Amar, no. Rav Papa says no, that is not correct. Rav Papa says the Kuli Alma Gozrin. Rav Papa says no, in fact that's not the case. In fact, everyone agrees that we enact protective rabbinic law even in the Beis Hamikdash as well. So what's the case over here? This is very interesting. V'hacha bedama tamtzis matzui l'rabos adam hanefesh kamiflagi. So Rav Papa says like this. The machlokes is actually something else. The machlokes says, is it common to have more dam tamtzis than lifeblood? So remember again, dam tamtzis is the residual blood. So the shaila over here is it common to have more residual blood or to have more, right, than it is to have lifeblood? Which one ultimately again is that common? So the Gemara says, Mar sar shchiach, Mar sar lo shchiach. So one opinion holds, yes, that is common, and ultimately again the second opinion says it's not common. So a fundamental machlokes, obviously we'll say, so this is fascinating, it's just a fundamental machlokes, would it be common or not to have more residual blood? So the Gemara says, Bishal the Rav Papa. So according to Rav Papa, Hainu diktani nesari b'dama psula yishbach la'ama, or b'dama tamtzes yishbach la'ama. So we'll say, so according to Rav Papa, who understands over here that there's two cases. Really, the machlokes case over here is dama tamtzes, not the other case. Then it makes sense why the Mishnah singles out dama tamtzes. Elo Rav Zvid la'arvinhu v'lesninu. But according to Rav Zvid, why not go ahead ultimately again and mix all of the cases together? Put the cases together, to which the Gemara says, kasha. Einachinami, again, that is a question, right? Einachinami, that is a valid question on the way the Mishnah is structured. So I'll say, so bottom line, fundamental machlokes in Tanakama, fundamental machlokes in Rav Zvid and Rav Papa, as to the nature of the Mishnah. Rav Zvid understands over here that the machlokes is, do we enact protective rabbinic law in the Beis Hamikdash? Tanakama says yes. Rabbi Elazar says no. According to Rav Papa, the fundamental machlokes becomes, do we have to be concerned that there will be more residual blood than lifeblood? Ultimately, again, one opinion says yes, one opinion says no. So fundamental machlokes both say, shkoyach, end of the sugya, will Meretz Hashem begin tomorrow with the new Mishnah. Wonderful. What a morning. What a morning. All right, have a great day, everyone.
Road as opposed to road, you know, the road would have to be a lot more.
Say it again.
I said road would just be like 51 or 49, but road, the appearance would be a lot more.
Correct.
Correct. For it to really wash it out.
Correct. Two different mechanisms.
Okay.